Picture this: Spanish conquistadors, fresh from destroying the Aztec Empire, riding north into what would become Arizona and New Mexico. They've seen it all, or so they think. Then they encounter the Apache. Now I want you to understand something about the Spanish mindset here. These conquistadors had spent decades convincing themselves they were God's chosen instruments, destined to bring civilization to the savage Americas. They'd crushed the Inca. They'd melted down Aztec gold by the ton. They figured the northern frontier would be more of the same, another collection of settled peoples to intimidate, convert, and exploit. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The Apache weren't like the peoples the Spanish had conquered before. No sprawling cities to capture, no emperors to ransom, no temples packed with gold, just emptiness. Mile after mile of desert that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to enter it. And somewhere in that wasteland, shadows that moved like smoke and struck like lightning. The Spanish called them Apache, enemy. It's one of those words that tells you everything about the people doing the naming, doesn't it? Not the people who live here or the mountain dwellers, just enemy, because that's all the Spanish could see when they looked at these masters of the high desert. But here's what the Spanish didn't understand, couldn't understand really. The Apache weren't their enemies because they were naturally warlike savages. They were enemies because they were free, completely, utterly free in a way that made European minds uncomfortable. Think about Apache society for a moment. No kings, no nobles, no peasants. Leadership came from wisdom, from spiritual power, from proven ability in war or hunting. A man might lead a raid one day and follow someone else's orders the next, depending on who had the best plan. Women like Lozan, and we'll talk more about her later, could become warriors and spiritual leaders. Children learned by watching, by doing, by making their own mistakes and living with the consequences. This wasn't anarchy. This was something far more sophisticated, a society that balanced individual freedom with collective survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And it worked. God, did it work? Let me paint you a picture of what an Apache childhood looked like. Take young Goyakla. You know him better as Geronimo. Born around 1829 in the Gila Mountains of what's now New Mexico. From the time he could walk, he was learning skills that would make modern special forces operators weep with envy. By age 8, Goyakla could track a deer across stone. By 12, he could read the sky like a book, knowing exactly when the afternoon thunderstorms would hit the high country, when the flash floods would roar down the arroyos. By 16, he could cover 40 miles on foot in a day, through terrain that would break most men, and arrive ready to fight. But it wasn't just physical prowess. Apache children learned to think tactically from birth. They played games that taught them to move silently, to observe without being observed, to remember every detail of a landscape they'd seen only once. Girls learned alongside boys, because when your people might need to disappear into the mountains at a moment's notice, everyone had better know how to survive. The Apache had been perfecting guerrilla warfare for centuries before the term was even invented. They understood something that military theorists are still trying to figure out. In the right terrain, with the right knowledge, a small force can make itself nearly invincible. Consider their relationship with horses. The Spanish brought horses to the Americas, thinking they'd maintained their cavalry advantage forever. Within a generation, Apache warriors were riding circles around Spanish horsemen, literally. They'd learned not just to ride, but to become one with their mounts in ways that seemed supernatural to European eyes. An Apache warrior could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while hanging off the side of a galloping horse. He could change mounts in mid-chase, switching to a fresh horse without ever touching the ground. Most impressively, he could make his horse disappear. I'm serious about this. Apache warriors developed techniques for camouflaging their horses, for moving them through terrain where Europeans swore no horse could go, for hiding entire herds in canyons that looked empty from 100 yards away. But here's the thing that really made the Apache dangerous. They thought differently about war itself. Europeans fought to conquer territory, to hold ground, to force decisive battles. The Apache fought to survive, to maintain their freedom, to protect their families. They didn't need to win battles in any conventional sense. They just needed to make conquests so costly, so exhausting, so endlessly frustrating that their enemies would eventually give up and go away, and for 300 years. This strategy worked brilliantly. The Spanish established missions and presidios throughout Apache country. The Apache burned them. The Spanish sent punitive expeditions into the mountains. The Apache vanished like smoke, then reappeared 100 miles away to raid some other settlement. The Spanish tried to make peace treaties. The Apache signed them when convenient, ignored them when not, and always kept their options open. Now, I don't want to romanticize this. Apache warfare could be brutal. Captives might face torture. Raids meant death and destruction for Mexican and later American settlers who had nothing to do with government policies. War parties sometimes killed women and children along with men. But before you judge too harshly, remember what the Apache were fighting for: their homeland, their families, their entire way of life, and remember what their enemies were trying to do to them. The Apache perfected what we'd now call asymmetric warfare. Small bands, often no more than a dozen warriors, could terrorize regions the size of entire states. They moved fast, struck hard, and vanished before anyone could respond. They knew every waterhole, every hidden trail, every cave system across thousands of square miles of seemingly empty desert. Most importantly, they had something their enemies could never match. They belonged to this land in a way that went deeper than ownership, deeper than maps drawn by distant governments. The desert wasn't their enemy to be conquered. It was their ally, their protector, their home. Women like Lozin, the warrior woman of the Warm Springs Apache, developed what they called power, spiritual abilities that seemed to let them sense danger before it arrived. Lozin could reportedly stand on a mountaintop, spread her arms, and know which direction enemies were approaching from. Skeptics can call it superstition, but I'll tell you what, those Apache who listened to Lozin lived longer than those who didn't. The Apache had dozens of separate bands: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, Western Apache, and others. They spoke different dialects, followed different customs, sometimes even fought among themselves. But when faced with common enemies, they could unite with devastating effectiveness. Information traveled through Apache networks faster than official military dispatches. A band being pursued in Arizona might receive support from cousins in New Mexico before the soldiers chasing them even knew other Apache were in the area. By the 1840s, the Apache had been successfully playing Spanish, Mexican, and early American interests against each other for generations. They'd take protection from Mexico against Texas Rangers, then ally with Americans against Mexican troops, then slip away from both to raid freight wagons crossing their territory. It was sophisticated diplomacy, backed by the constant threat of violence, and it kept them free when other tribes had already been conquered or removed. But times were changing. The Mexican War ended in 1848. And suddenly, the Apache found themselves dealing with a new kind of enemy. The Americans weren't interested in converting souls or establishing a few scattered settlements. They wanted the land itself, all of it, and they had the industrial capacity to take it. The California Gold Rush brought thousands of fortune seekers streaming across Apache territory. The Gadsden Purchase in 1854 officially made much of Apacheria part of the United States. Railroad surveyors began mapping routes through sacred mountains. Prospectors violated religious sites looking for ore. Ranchers claimed grasslands that had fed Apache horses for generations. Most ominously, American military leaders studied Apache tactics with professional interest. Men like General George Crook understood they were facing the most skilled guerrilla fighters in North America. Unlike Spanish or Mexican commanders who often underestimated their enemies, Americans began developing counter-guerrilla strategies specifically designed to defeat Apache advantages. The stage was set for the final act of the Apache Wars, a conflict that would produce legends on both sides and end with one of the most tragic betrayals in American military History, but that's a story for our next chapter. For now, remember this. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered the Apache in the 1500s, they met a people who had achieved something remarkable. In one of the harshest environments on Earth, they'd created a society that balanced individual freedom with collective strength, that turned weakness into strategic advantage, that made the desert itself into their greatest weapon. The Apache weren't defeated because they weren't good enough warriors. They were defeated because the world changed around them. The question we'll explore next is whether that defeat was really final, or whether the eagle was just learning to fly in new skies. The year 1848 changed everything. And I mean everything. Think about it from an Apache perspective for a moment. One day you're dealing with Mexican authorities. Corrupt, underfunded, generally more interested in staying alive than enforcing abstract territorial claims. The next day, these new people show up speaking a different language, wearing different uniforms, making promises that sound too good to be true, because they were too good to be true. The Treaty of Guadalupe. Hidalgo didn't just end the Mexican-American War. It carved up the Apache homeland like a butcher dividing a carcass, without bothering to ask the people who'd been living there for centuries what they thought about the arrangement. Suddenly, sacred mountains that had watched over Apache ceremonies since time immemorial belonged to something called the United States of America. The Apache chiefs weren't stupid. They understood that new rulers meant new rules. So they did what they'd always done. They tried diplomacy first. Enter Mangus Coloradus. Red sleeves. 6 feet 6 inches tall, in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. A giant among his people, both literally and figuratively. When Mangus Coloradus walked into a room, conversation stopped. When he spoke, people listened. For 40 years, he'd led the Mimbreño Apache through wars and peace treaties, raids and negotiations. He understood power, how to project it, how to use it, how to recognize it in others. Mangus Coloradus looked at these Americans and saw something the Spanish and Mexicans had never possessed: genuine strength. Not just military might, but industrial capacity, organizational ability, the kind of systematic approach to conquest that could actually succeed where others had failed. So he made a fateful decision. He would try to work with them. The first meetings went well enough. American officials needed Apache knowledge of the terrain, Apache scouts who could guide their expeditions, Apache neutrality while they established their authority over former Mexican territories. The Apache needed trade goods, wanted protection from Mexican slave raids, hoped to maintain some control over their traditional hunting grounds. It seemed like a deal both sides could live with, but then came the gold seekers. The California gold rush of 1849 sent thousands of fortune hunters streaming across Apache territory. These weren't soldiers operating under government orders or settlers looking for farmland. These were desperate men in a hurry, men who saw Apache people as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be negotiated with. The Apache watched these wagon trains with growing alarm. Each group brought stories of more coming behind them. The trickle became a flood. Sacred water sources were fouled by mining operations. Game animals fled the noise and commotion. Traditional gathering grounds were claimed by men who'd never seen this country before and had no intention of staying once they'd extracted its wealth. Worse yet, many of these gold seekers were armed and jumpy. They shot first and asked questions later. Apache hunting parties found themselves under fire from terrified migrants who couldn't tell the difference between a war party and a family. Group heading to seasonal camps. The violence escalated predictably. Miners killed Apache people. Apache warriors retaliated against mining camps. American newspapers back east published lurid accounts of savage attacks, conveniently omitting the context that had provoked them. Military commanders received orders to pacify the region using whatever methods proved necessary. This is where the story gets really dark. Because the Americans didn't just bring superior firepower, they brought a different moral framework entirely. The Spanish had wanted to convert the Apache. The Mexicans had wanted to contain them. The Americans wanted to remove them completely. The Apache represented obstacles to manifest destiny, impediments to railroad construction, barriers to the kind of systematic development that would transform the Southwest into productive territory. In 1851, Mingus Coloradas agreed to meet with American officials under a flag of truce. He came in good faith, probably hoping to negotiate some kind of accommodation that would let his people maintain at least part of their homeland. What happened next still makes my blood boil. American soldiers seized Mingus Coloradas during the negotiations. They tied him up and began torturing him with heated bayonets, burning his legs and feet while demanding information about Apache strongholds and hidden camps. The great chief, this man who'd commanded warriors for decades, who'd never backed down from Spanish armies or Mexican expeditions, was tortured like a common criminal. They murdered him that night, shot him in the head while he lay bound and helpless. Then they cut off his head and boiled the flesh from his skull, sending it east to phrenologists who wanted to study the cranium of a savage chief. I want you to think about what that meant to the Apache people. Mingus Coloradas wasn't just another war leader. He was a bridge between the old ways and the new reality, a man who'd tried to find peaceful accommodation with overwhelming force. His torture and murder under a flag of truce sent a message that no Apache could misunderstand. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no honorable solution to this conflict. The Americans had declared total war. Among those who witnessed this betrayal was Cochise, chief of the Chiricahua Apache and son-in-law to Mingus Coloradas. Cochise had been leaning toward accommodation himself, had even cooperated with American authorities in tracking down raiders from other bands. That cooperation ended the night Mingus Coloradas died. From 1861 forward, Cochise waged 12 years of brilliant warfare against American forces. Not the hit-and-run tactics that had frustrated Spanish and Mexican authorities, but systematic campaigns designed to make American occupation impossibly costly. Cochise understood something his predecessors hadn't fully grasped. The Americans were different. They wouldn't be discouraged by occasional defeats or frustrated by elusive enemies. They would keep coming until they either won decisively or found the cost of victory unbearable. So Cochise set out to make victory unbearable. His warriors attacked supply trains, burned way stations, destroyed telegraph lines. They made travel through Apache territory so dangerous that many Americans simply avoided the region entirely. Stage lines rerouted around Chiricahua strongholds. Military expeditions required massive escorts that drained resources from other operations. Most brilliantly, Cochise fought a war of intelligence. His network of informants extended from Mexico City to San Francisco. He knew about American troop movements before the soldiers themselves did. He understood supply schedules, patrol routes, the personal habits of individual commanders. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Cochise immediately grasped its implications. With most regular army units pulled east to fight the Confederacy, the Southwest was defended by poorly trained volunteers who knew nothing about Apache warfare. For 4 years, Cochise's warriors had virtual free reign across Arizona and New Mexico, but the Americans kept coming. They built forts in previously unoccupied areas. They established permanent settlements in places the Apache had considered temporarily conquered. Most ominously, they began construction of something that would change the strategic balance forever: the railroad. Those iron rails represented everything the Apache had been fighting against. Permanent occupation, industrial development, the transformation of their homeland into something alien and hostile to their way of life. The Southern Pacific Railroad pushed through. Apache territory, like a poisoned spear aimed at the heart of their resistance. Every mile of track completed meant another nail in the coffin of Apache independence. The rails brought supplies faster than wagon trains, troops fresher than those who'd marched across the desert, settlers in numbers that dwarfed anything seen before. Apache war parties struck back desperately. They derailed trains, burned bridges, attacked construction crews. But for every mile of track they destroyed, American engineers built two more. The Iron Serpent kept growing, kept spreading, kept bringing more enemies into the homeland. In 1867, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Suddenly, the American military could move entire regiments across the country in a matter of days rather than months. The Apache found themselves facing not just local garrisons, but the full industrial might of a nation that had just finished tearing itself apart in civil war and was looking for new challenges to conquer. Enter General George Crook. Now, Crook was different from the political appointees and glory seekers who'd commanded American forces in the Southwest. This was a professional soldier who studied his enemies with scientific precision. He'd fought in the Civil War, had seen what modern military organization could accomplish against determined opponents. Crook looked at the Apache problem and reached some uncomfortable conclusions. Traditional cavalry operations were useless against enemies who could outrun horses on foot and disappear into terrain where no mounted force could follow. Supply trains moving at wagon speed would always be vulnerable to raiders who traveled light and struck fast. Occupying every valley and canyon would require more troops than the army possessed, so Crook developed new tactics that worked. First, he recruited Apache scouts to fight against their own people. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. Apache bands had sometimes allied with enemies against traditional rivals. But Crook systematized the practice, offering steady pay, regular food, and protection for families in exchange for military service. The psychological impact was devastating. Apache warriors found themselves tracked by men who knew all their tricks, pursued by forces that could match their mobility, betrayed by people who understood their thinking patterns and cultural blind spots. Second, Crook authorized winter campaigns. Previously, American forces had generally suspended operations during the cold months, allowing Apache families to rest in hidden camps and warriors to recover from summer fighting. Crook's columns attacked in December and January, when snow blocked high mountain passes and families were vulnerable in their winter refuges. Third, Crook pursued Apache bands into Mexico. The international border had always provided sanctuary for raiders who could strike American targets, then disappear into Mexican territory where pursuit was diplomatically impossible. Crook convinced both governments to allow hot pursuit operations that eliminated this safe haven. The combination was lethal. Apache bands found themselves hunted year-round by enemies who moved as fast as they did, knew their hideouts, and couldn't be escaped by crossing borders. One by one, the great war chiefs began surrendering. Not from cowardice. These men had proven their courage 1,000 times over, but from recognition that continued resistance meant the extinction of their people. Cochise held out longer than most. His stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains of southeastern Arizona seemed impregnable. His warriors still controlled vast stretches of territory. His intelligence network continued providing advance warning of American movements, but even Cochise could see the writing on the wall. In 1872, he finally agreed to negotiations with General Oliver Howard. The talks lasted 11 days. At the end, Cochise accepted a reservation in his traditional territory, with himself as chief of police and his son as his designated successor. It seemed like an honorable compromise. The Chiricahua Apache would give up raiding in exchange for peace and a homeland they could call their own. But Cochise was dying. Cancer probably, though no doctor examined him. By 1874, the great war chief was dead, and the fragile peace he'd negotiated died with him. American officials immediately began pressuring the Chiricahua to move to a different reservation, one that would be easier to supervise and less strategically important. Young warriors, raised on stories of their fathers' victories, chafed at the restrictions of reservation life. The old cycle of raid and retaliation began again, but this time there was a new player in the game. A man whose name would become legend on both sides of the border, whose story would embody both the triumph and tragedy of Apache resistance. His birth name was Goyakla. The Mexicans called him Geronimo, and his war was just beginning. 1858. A young Apache warrior named Goyakla returns from a trading expedition to find his mother, his wife, and his 3 small children butchered by Mexican soldiers. Their bodies lie scattered around the burned remains of their camp like broken dolls. This is the moment Geronimo is born. Now, I need you to understand something about Apache culture and the nature of spiritual transformation. The Apache believed deeply in what they called power, supernatural abilities that came through visions, through suffering, through direct contact with the spirit world. Power could make a warrior bulletproof, could grant the ability to see the future, could allow someone to heal the sick or find water in the desert. Goyakla had been a competent warrior before that terrible day in 1858. After it, he became something else entirely, something that transcended normal human limitations. The Mexican soldiers who killed his family had called on Saint Jerome, San Geronimo, for protection during the fight. When this transformed Apache warrior began hunting them down one by one, they started crying out, "Geronimo! Geronimo!" Whether in fear or desperate prayer, nobody knows. The name stuck. The man who had been Goyakla was gone forever, replaced by an avenging spirit who seemed to move through the world by different rules than ordinary mortals. From 1876 forward, that name echoed across both sides of the border with the power to, terrified Geronimo just saying it could, empty a saloon in Tucson or send Mexican villagers fleeing to their churches. And here's the thing that made him truly dangerous. He was brilliant, not just as a warrior, which would have been frightening enough, but as a tactician and strategist who understood his enemies better than they understood themselves. Consider the numbers we're talking about here. At the height of his power, Geronimo commanded maybe 40 warriors. 40. That's smaller than most modern army platoons. With this tiny force, he humiliated armies of thousands, terrorized regions the size of entire states, and became the most wanted man in 2 nations. How? How does someone accomplish that? First, Geronimo possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of the terrain. The Sonoran Desert and the Sierra Madre Mountains weren't just his homeland, they were extensions of his own body. He knew every waterhole across hundreds of miles, every hidden trail, every cave system that could shelter his band. More importantly, he understood how to use geography as a weapon. American and Mexican forces would pursue Geronimo's warriors into what looked like empty desert, only to find themselves surrounded by hidden riflemen shooting from positions they couldn't even see. Cavalry units would charge into canyons that seemed to offer easy escape routes, only to discover the exits blocked by carefully placed rock slides. Supply trains would take what appeared to be safe roads, only to walk into ambushes prepared weeks in advance. But terrain knowledge alone doesn't explain Geronimo's success. Plenty of Apache warriors knew the country just as well. What made Geronimo special was his intelligence network. This man maintained informants from the Gila River to Mexico City. Peaceful Apache living on reservations would pass along information about troop movements. Mexican traders would share gossip about military preparations. Even some American soldiers, disgusted by the brutal tactics used against Apache families, would find ways to warn Geronimo when operations were planned against him. The result was that Geronimo often knew about enemy movements before the commanders planning them had finalized their orders. While American officers were still studying maps and organizing supply trains, Geronimo's warriors were already moving to counter their plans. Take the campaigns of 1885 and 1886. These became the stuff of legend, the kind of operations that military historians still study today. General Nelson Miles commanded the Department of Arizona during this period. Miles was no amateur. He'd fought in the Civil War, had extensive experience with Indian warfare, commanded resources that should have made quick work of any remaining Apache resistance. Miles deployed 5,000 American troops. 5,000. He had the cooperation of 4,000 Mexican soldiers operating south of the border. He possessed the latest military technology, heliograph stations for rapid communication, improved rifles, even experimental uses of barbed wire to control Apache movement. Against this overwhelming force, Geronimo fielded 18 warriors and their families. 18 men, plus women and children who slowed movement and required constant protection. For 18 months, those 18 warriors made fools of 9,000 soldiers. The key was Geronimo's tactical genius. He never fought fair, never gave his enemies the decisive battle they desperately wanted. Instead, he waged a campaign of psychological warfare designed to exhaust his pursuers, both physically and mentally. Geronimo's band would appear simultaneously in locations hundreds of miles apart, leading authorities to believe they faced multiple groups or that the Apache possessed supernatural powers of transportation. They accomplished this through careful coordination with other bands, shared intelligence networks, and Geronimo's uncanny ability to predict where searches would focus next. When pursued closely, Geronimo's warriors could cover 70 miles in a single day on foot. 70 miles. Across some of the most difficult terrain in North America, carrying weapons, supplies, sometimes wounded comrades. American cavalry, supposedly more mobile, averaged 20 miles per day and usually arrived at their destinations with exhausted horses and demoralized men. The Sierra Madre Mountains became Geronimo's fortress. This vast range straddling the Arizona-Mexico border contained thousands of square miles of labyrinthine canyons, hidden valleys, and secret water sources. Mexican authorities had never fully explored the region. American maps showed blank spaces marked unknown territory, but Geronimo knew every trail, every cave, every seasonal stream. His band could vanish into the Sierra Madre like smoke, emerging weeks later, hundreds of miles away to strike targets that had considered themselves completely safe. Supply became the foundation of Geronimo's strategy. While military expeditions struggled to maintain wagon trains across hostile territory, Apache warriors lived off cached supplies hidden throughout their range. Geronimo had spent years preparing for extended campaigns, stockpiling ammunition, food, and medical supplies in dozens of secret locations. These caches allowed his band to travel light and fast, while their pursuers struggled with heavy supply trains that moved at wagon speed and required constant protection. When Apache scouts working for the army managed to locate some of these hiding places, they usually found them already empty. Geronimo's intelligence network had warned him days in advance. But perhaps Geronimo's greatest weapon was his understanding of his enemy's psychology. He knew exactly how to manipulate American and Mexican fears, how to exploit their cultural blind spots, how to turn their strengths into weaknesses. American commanders, trained in conventional warfare, expected enemies to hold territory, to fight for strategic objectives, to behave according to European military traditions. Geronimo gave them none of these things. His objective wasn't conquest, it was continuation. As long as his people remained free, he was winning. Mexican authorities, traumatized by generations of Apache raids, tended to panic at the first sign of Geronimo's presence. A single attack might empty entire regions as terrified civilians fled to fortified towns. This exodus actually helped Geronimo by creating vast depopulated areas where his band could move freely. The psychological pressure on pursuing forces was enormous. Soldiers knew they were hunting the most dangerous man in North America, a warrior with an almost supernatural reputation who seemed to possess powers beyond normal human abilities. Every canyon might hide an ambush. Every peaceful-looking valley might be a trap. Every day in the field brought them deeper into country where Geronimo held every advantage. Meanwhile, newspaper coverage back east grew increasingly hysterical. Headlines screamed about savage raids and bloodthirsty Apache who threatened American expansion into the southwest. The longer Geronimo remained free, the more the army's reputation suffered. Political pressure mounted for a quick resolution to what was becoming a national embarrassment. General Miles understood he was fighting more than just 18 Apache warriors. He was fighting a legend that grew stronger with every failed expedition, every successful raid, every day that passed without Geronimo's capture. So Miles changed tactics. Instead of massive expeditions that Geronimo could detect and avoid, he deployed small units of Apache scouts who could match Geronimo's mobility and terrain knowledge. Instead of trying to control territory, he focused on harassing Geronimo's band constantly, giving them no time to rest, no opportunity to enjoy their freedom. Most importantly, Miles began targeting Geronimo's support network. Peaceful Apache on reservations found themselves under constant surveillance. Traders suspected of providing information faced arrest. Mexican officials received pressure to stop tolerating Apache raiders who crossed the border. The strategy worked slowly but relentlessly. Geronimo's intelligence network began breaking down as informants faced consequences for helping him. His supply caches were discovered and destroyed by Apache scouts who knew all the traditional hiding places. His band grew exhausted from constant flight, constant vigilance, constant fear of betrayal. By summer 1886, even Geronimo's legendary power couldn't overcome the mathematical reality of his situation. He commanded barely a dozen effective warriors. His ammunition was running low. His people were starving. Most critically, he could no longer guarantee the safety of the women and children who'd followed him into exile. The end began with a white flag in Skeleton Canyon, a desolate stretch of desert on the Arizona-New Mexico border. General Miles had sent word through intermediaries that he wanted to negotiate, that terms could be reached that would allow Geronimo's people to live. It was August 25, 1886. The temperature hit 110 degrees that afternoon. Geronimo rode into the canyon with his remaining warriors, knowing this might be his last act as a free man, but believing, still believing, that his power would protect his people one final time. He was wrong. And what happened next would haunt American military history for generations to come. September 1886. The train whistle screams across the Sonoran Desert as 4 cattle cars, packed with Apache prisoners, begin their journey into hell. I want you to picture this scene, because it's important you understand exactly what's happening here. These aren't just any prisoners. These are people who've lived their entire lives under the biggest sky in North America, in country where you can see 100 miles in any direction. Warriors who've ridden free across landscapes that stretch beyond the horizon. Children who've never seen a building taller than 2 stories, and now they're locked in windowless cattle cars, chained together like animals, breathing air thick with their own waste and desperation. The heat inside those cars defies description. We're talking about metal boxes sitting in the desert sun, internal temperatures rising above 130 degrees. Apache people, accustomed to the dry heat of high desert country, find themselves drowning in their own sweat. Children cry constantly from thirst. Elders collapse from heat exhaustion. The few windows, really just barred slots near the ceiling, provide no relief. Only glimpses of alien landscape rolling past like a fever dream, but the physical discomfort is nothing compared to the psychological torture of watching their homeland disappear mile by mile. Think about what that means to a people whose entire spiritual universe centers on specific mountains, particular springs, sacred sites that have anchored their ceremonies for centuries. Every mile eastward carries them further from the sources of their power, deeper into country where their medicine doesn't work, their spirits can't find them. Their ancestors' voices grow faint and strange. At El Paso, the train stops for water and coal. Crowds gather to gawk at the savage Apache through the barred windows. Vendors sell postcards showing Geronimo in chains. Photographers charge tourists a quarter to pose next to the cars containing wild Indians from the frontier. This is where the story gets truly obscene. These aren't just prisoners being transported. They're exhibits in a traveling freak show. Their suffering converted into entertainment. for people who've never seen an Apache person before and probably never will again. The Apache warriors sit in stoic silence while strangers point and laugh and take pictures. What else can they do? They're chained to the floor of a cattle car, helpless as circus animals, while crowds outside treat their misery as an amusing spectacle. But watch the children. The Apache children pressed against those barred windows, staring out at landscapes they've never imagined. Desert gives way to grassland. Grassland becomes forest. The air grows thick and humid in ways that make it hard to breathe. These children have never seen trees that stay green all year. They've never experienced humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin. They've never felt air so thick you can almost drink it. Every mile carries them further from anything familiar, deeper into a world that operates by different rules than anything they've ever known. At San Antonio, more crowds gather. The local newspaper runs headlines about the bloodthirsty Apache being transported through the city. Veterans of frontier wars point out Geronimo to their children, telling exaggerated stories of raids and massacres. The irony is suffocating. These bloodthirsty Apache sit chained and helpless, while the people calling them savage celebrate their capture as a triumph of civilization. Who exactly is behaving in a civilized manner here? The train rolls through Louisiana, and the landscape becomes truly alien. Swamps stretch to the horizon. Spanish moss hangs from trees like the ghosts of dead things. The air grows so humid that Apache people, raised in country where water is precious, find themselves gasping for breath. Children develop fevers. Elders begin coughing fits that shake their entire bodies. The respiratory systems of people accustomed to thin, dry mountain air simply can't process the thick, moisture-laden atmosphere of the Gulf Coast. Some don't survive the journey. An elderly woman dies somewhere in Alabama, her body worn out by heat, stress, and the shock of complete displacement. A young child succumbs to fever in Mississippi. Their bodies are buried in unmarked graves beside the railroad tracks, their spirits abandoned in soil that will never know their names. The dead are mourning more than just those who die. Apache mothers cut their hair in grief rituals for their entire way of life. Warriors sing death songs under their breath, preparing their souls for whatever comes next, because they understand, better than their captors realize, that the people who left Arizona are not the same people who will arrive in Florida. The journey itself is killing something essential about who they are. At every stop, the crowds grow larger and more curious. Word has spread along the telegraph lines that the famous Geronimo is passing through. Newspaper reporters climb aboard to interview the savage chief, asking stupid questions through interpreters who barely speak Apache. How many white men have you killed? Do you regret your crimes against civilization? What do you think of the president's mercy in sparing your life? Geronimo stares at these reporters with eyes that have seen things they could never imagine. What can he tell them? How do you explain to people who've never been free what it means to lose your freedom? How do you describe the death of a way of life to people who think civilization means forcing everyone to live the same way? The questions reveal more about the questioners than any answers could. These reporters see Apache people as curiosities, exotic specimens to be studied and displayed. They have no conception that they're dealing with human beings whose inner lives are as complex and meaningful as their own. As the train enters Florida, the humidity becomes almost unbearable. Apache people, raised at elevations where the air is thin and clean, find themselves struggling to breathe atmosphere that feels more like soup than air. The vegetation grows stranger with each mile. Palmetto trees and Spanish moss, alligators and tropical birds. Nothing here resembles the high desert country that shaped Apache civilization for centuries. Children point at their first palm tree, their first glimpse of ocean birds. Under different circumstances, this might be adventure, exploration, discovery. Instead, it's exile from everything they've ever known into a world that might as well be another planet. The train finally pulls into St. Augustine on a suffocatingly humid morning in September. The whistle echoes off ancient Spanish walls as Apache prisoners get their first glimpse of Fort Marion. The fortress squats beside the Matanzas River like a stone toad, its walls sweating in the tropical heat. Spanish conquistadors built this place 3 centuries ago to defend their colony against pirates and foreign enemies. Now it will be used to defend American civilization against something far more dangerous, the stubborn refusal of Apache people to disappear quietly into history as the cattle car doors swing open. Apache people step onto soil their ancestors' spirits will never find. The physical journey is over, but their real ordeal is just beginning. Captain Richard Henry Pratt waits inside those ancient walls with plans that will make the train journey seem like a pleasure cruise. Pratt believes he can kill the Indian, save the man, through systematic destruction of everything that makes Apache children Apache. He has classrooms prepared where Apache languages will be forbidden, uniforms ready to replace traditional clothing, teachers trained in techniques designed to strip away cultural identity as efficiently as you'd strip bark from a tree. The Spanish, who built Fort Marion, never imagined their fortress would one day contain the last free warriors of the Southwest. But history has a way of creating ironies that no one sees coming. Apache warriors who commanded armies now shuffle through gates built by conquistadors, entering a prison designed by their enemies' enemies. The wheel of conquest has turned full circle, and the Apache find themselves trapped not just by stone walls, but by the accumulated weight of 5 centuries of European expansion into the Americas. But here's something Captain Pratt doesn't understand, something the Spanish conquistadors never grasped either. You can imprison bodies, you can forbid languages, you can cut hair and change clothes and force children to march in formation, but you cannot kill the spirit of a people who've survived everything history has thrown at them. You cannot destroy the essential knowledge that passes from one generation to the next, through stories, through songs, through the simple act of remembering who you are and where you come from. The Apache people entering Fort Marion carry that knowledge with them into the darkest chapter of their long story. It will be tested in ways no people should ever have to endure, but it will survive. It has to survive, because the alternative is the death of something precious and irreplaceable, the last echo of voices that once called across the mountains of the Southwest, free as eagles, wild as the desert wind. Fort Marion, September 1886. The ancient Spanish gates clang shut behind the last Apache prisoners, and Captain Richard Henry Pratt rubs his hands together with the satisfaction of a man about to conduct the greatest experiment in cultural destruction ever attempted on American soil. Pratt isn't a monster, not in his own mind. He genuinely believes he's saving these people from themselves. His philosophy, kill the Indian, save the man, sounds almost humanitarian when he explains it to visiting dignitaries and newspaper reporters. The idea is simple, elegant, and utterly ruthless. Strip away everything that makes Apache children Apache. The language, the customs, the spiritual beliefs, the very way they think about themselves and their place in the world. Replace all of that with European American values, Christian morality, and industrial discipline. Transform them into brown-skinned white people, grateful for civilization and eager to disappear into the American mainstream. What could be more merciful than that? The process begins immediately. Apache children are separated from their parents and marched into Fort Marion's humid stone chambers. Boys on one side, girls on the other. Families that have survived warfare, exile, and the death march across the continent are now torn apart by bureaucratic efficiency. The first weapon in Pratt's arsenal is the scissors. Apache men wear their hair long for spiritual reasons. It's not vanity or fashion, it's a fundamental part of who they are. Connected to their power, their connection to the spirit world, and their identity as Apache people. Pratt's assistants hold down struggling children, while barbers shave their heads like sheep. The hair falls to the stone floor in black piles, carrying with it something essential about the children's souls. Watch young Chapo, Geronimo's son, as strangers force him into a chair and begin cutting away hair that has never been touched by scissors. He doesn't cry. Apache children are taught not to show weakness in front of enemies. But his eyes hold a kind of bewildered grief that cuts deeper than any scream. The warrior Toclani watches through barred windows as his daughter emerges from the building with her head shaved. Looking like a stranger, she's still his child, but something fundamental has been stolen from her, something that can never be replaced. After the haircuts come the uniforms. Wool military-style clothing designed for European climates, impossibly hot and scratchy in the Florida humidity. Apache children, accustomed to soft deerskin that moves with their bodies, find themselves trapped in rigid costumes that make every movement uncomfortable. The girls are dressed like Victorian ladies in training, long skirts, high collars, tight shoes that pinch their feet. The boys wear military uniforms, complete with brass buttons and stiff collars that chafe their necks, raw in the tropical heat. But the real assault begins when Pratt opens his classrooms. The first rule is absolute. No Apache languages allowed. Children caught speaking their native tongue are beaten, forced to stand in corners for hours, denied food. Teachers patrol the dormitories at night, listening for whispered conversations in forbidden languages. The punishment for cultural persistence is swift and brutal. Children who sing traditional songs are locked in solitary confinement. Those who practice Apache customs are publicly humiliated. Anyone caught teaching younger children about their heritage faces weeks of punishment that would break grown men. Pratt has studied the psychology of cultural destruction with scientific precision. He understands that language carries more than just words. It carries entire ways of thinking, complete worldviews, the accumulated wisdom of generations. Destroy the language, and you destroy the people's ability to think like themselves. The replacement curriculum is designed to remake Apache minds from the ground up. Christian prayers replace traditional ceremonies. English literature supplants oral traditions. Industrial training prepares children for lives as factory workers or domestic servants. Everything Apache is labeled savage and primitive. Everything European American is presented as civilized and progressive. The message is clear. Your people's way of life is worthless, shameful, something to be forgotten as quickly as possible. But here's where Pratt's experiment encounters something he didn't expect: the stubborn resilience of people who've survived. Everything history has thrown at them, Apache resistance, takes new forms inside Fort Marion's walls. Open rebellion is impossible, but cultural persistence becomes an act of guerrilla warfare, waged in whispers and hidden gestures. Apache mothers find ways to continue teaching their children, even while pretending to embrace domesticity training. While learning to sew proper clothing, women like Iteda embed traditional patterns into their work. Beadwork that carries hidden meanings. Designs that tell stories from the old days. The white matrons think they're watching Apache women learn civilized skills. They have no idea they're witnessing the preservation of an entire cultural code transmitted through seemingly innocent handicrafts. In the boys' dormitory, young warriors like Nightshade, son of the great chief Cochise, begin creating what will later be called ledger art. Using pencils and paper intended for writing English lessons, they draw scenes from the life they've lost: buffalo hunts, war parties, ceremonial dances, mountain landscapes that live now only in memory. The teachers think these drawings are harmless attempts at artistic expression. They don't understand that Apache children are creating visual libraries, preserving their history in images that words cannot capture. At night, when the guards think them broken and defeated, Apache people find ways to sing. Not the loud power songs that would bring immediate punishment, but whispered lullabies that carry the essence of who they are. Mothers teach their children traditional stories while pretending to read Bible verses. Warriors pass along tactical knowledge through what look like innocent conversations about farming. Spiritual leaders preserve sacred knowledge by embedding it in seemingly Christian prayers. The resistance is invisible to their captors, but absolutely essential to Apache survival. Every whispered word in their native language is an act of rebellion. Every traditional story told in the darkness is a victory against cultural genocide, but the cost is enormous. Children develop what we'd now recognize as severe psychological trauma. They're caught between two worlds, forbidden to be Apache, but never truly accepted as anything else. The milk and cookies incident crystallizes the cruel absurdity of the entire enterprise. Apache children, raised on pine nuts and venison, find European-American food revolting. Their digestive systems, adapted to traditional diets, can't process milk and refined sugar. Many Apache people are lactose intolerant, making dairy products literally sickening. But Pratt's matrons insist that refusing milk and cookies proves the children's savage inability to appreciate civilized comforts. When Apache children cry over forced consumption of foods that make them ill, guards see evidence of primitive stubbornness rather than biological reality. The children aren't crying because they're ungrateful. They're crying because they're homesick for foods that connected them to their land and ancestors. They want dried mezcal that tastes like mountain sunshine. They want the clean, sharp flavor of desert spring water. They want foods that remind them who they are. Instead, they get chalk-flavored cookies and milk that makes them sick to their stomachs. The medical consequences of Fort Marion become apparent within months. Tuberculosis spreads through the humid stone chambers like wildfire. Apache people, accustomed to clean, dry air, find their lungs attacked by bacteria that thrive in the tropical dampness. Children who've never been seriously ill begin coughing up blood. Elders who survived decades of warfare succumb to respiratory infections their bodies can't fight. The mortality rate climbs steadily as Apache immune systems, adapted to high desert conditions, fail to cope with East Coast diseases. Pratt explains these deaths as unfortunate but necessary casualties in the war against savagery. The weak die so the strong can be saved for civilization. It's the cost of progress, the price of transformation. But Apache people understand they're watching genocide disguised as education. Their children aren't dying from disease. They're dying from heartbreak, from cultural starvation, from the systematic destruction of everything that gives life meaning. Yet even in this darkest chapter, something extraordinary happens. The very brutality of Pratt's system creates unexpected bonds between Apache people and other prisoners at Fort Marion. The fortress also holds members of other tribes, Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne warriors who've fought their own battles against American expansion. These men share stories, compare tactics, discover common ground in their resistance to cultural destruction. For the first time in their history, warriors from traditionally enemy tribes begin thinking of themselves as part of something larger, an indigenous resistance movement that transcends old rivalries. The white authorities don't understand what they're creating. By throwing together the most dangerous Native Americans from across the continent, they're accidentally fostering the birth of pan-Indian identity that will reshape Native politics for generations to come. Apache children forbidden to speak their own language begin learning Kiowa and Cheyenne words. Warriors who once fought each other now share knowledge about surviving cultural assault. Traditional enemies become allies in the fight to preserve something essential about who they are, but the most important resistance comes from an unexpected source, the curious tourists who pay admission to watch tame Indians perform for their entertainment. Pratt encourages these visits as proof of his success. Look how civilized the Apache have become. See how they've learned to march in formation and speak English. Witness the triumph of American education over primitive savagery. The tourists see what they expect to see. Defeated enemies transformed into grateful recipients of civilization. But Apache performers are playing a deeper game. Geronimo, the most famous prisoner, becomes a master of this psychological warfare. He poses for photographs, signs autographs, tells carefully edited stories about his savage past. The tourists think they're seeing a broken old man grateful for salvation. They have no idea they're watching one of the greatest tactical minds in Apache history, manipulating their expectations while preserving his people's dignity. Every performance is an act of resistance. Every story told to wide-eyed tourists contains hidden layers of meaning that preserve Apache history while satisfying white curiosity. Geronimo transforms himself from prisoner into performer, using his captor's desire for spectacle to maintain some control over his own narrative. But perhaps the most profound resistance comes from something Pratt never anticipated: love. Apache families, torn apart by bureaucratic cruelty, find ways to maintain connections across the fortress's rigid divisions. Mothers and fathers, forbidden direct contact with their children, develop elaborate systems of communication through intermediaries and hidden messages. Children separated from their parents create new family structures with other prisoners. Apache warriors become surrogate fathers to orphaned children from other tribes. Women who've lost their own families adopt youngsters who need mothering. The bonds forged in Fort Marion's stone chambers prove stronger than anything Pratt's system can destroy. Love transcends language barriers, survives cultural assault, adapts to conditions that would break lesser spirits. After 3 years in Florida, the Apache prisoners are transferred to Alabama. The official explanation is that they need more vocational training, better facilities, opportunities for productive labor. The real reason is that Fort Marion has become an embarrassment. Too many prisoners have died. Too many reports of harsh conditions have reached sympathetic newspapers. Too many questions are being asked about the morality of imprisoning women and children indefinitely, but the damage has already been done. The Apache who leave Fort Marion are not the same people who entered it. They've been changed by their experience in ways both visible and hidden. Some have been broken by the ordeal, their spirits crushed by systematic cultural violence. Others have been strengthened, their identity refined and focused by resistance to destruction. All carry scars that will never fully heal. But they also carry something their captors never understood and could never destroy: the unbreakable knowledge of who they are and where they come from. The stone walls of Fort Marion could imprison their bodies. Pratt's system could forbid their languages and destroy their traditional ways of life, but it could not kill the essential spirit that makes Apache people Apache. That spirit adapted, evolved, found new ways to survive and resist and endure, because eagles may be caged, but they never forget how to fly. October 14th, 1913. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Geronimo lies dying in a military hospital bed, pneumonia filling his lungs with fluid, his legendary power finally failing him in this alien place where his ancestors' spirits cannot find him. 27 years. 27 years since he surrendered under that white flag in Skeleton Canyon, believing General Miles's promises that Apache families would be reunited after a brief imprisonment. 27 years of captivity in Florida, Alabama, and finally Oklahoma. Humid, flat country that bears no resemblance to the sacred mountains of his birth. He will die a prisoner of war, never again seeing the Chiricahua homeland that shaped his soul. The man who humiliated armies of thousands, who turned the entire Southwest into his battlefield, who became the most feared warrior in 2 nations, dies forgotten in a government hospital while the world prepares for a war that will make Apache resistance seem like a childhood game. But Geronimo's death is not the end of the Apache story. It's the beginning of something new, something his captors never anticipated and couldn't prevent. From the ashes of Fort Marion, from the broken spirits of Alabama prison camps, from the forced assimilation of Oklahoma reservations, eagles are beginning to rise. The statistics tell part of the story. Of the 498 Apache people loaded onto those cattle cars in 1886, fewer than 300 survived to see even limited freedom. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and broken hearts have claimed nearly 200 lives, a mortality, a rate that would constitute genocide by any reasonable standard. But the survivors carry something their captors never understood and couldn't destroy: the essential knowledge that makes Apache people Apache. And in the strangest twist of historical irony, some of the very people Pratt tried to civilize become the bridges between the old world and the new. Take Jason Betsinez, nephew of Geronimo, captured as a young man and subjected to the full Fort Marion treatment. Pratt's system taught him to read and write English, skills his captors intended to use for cultural destruction. Instead, Betsinez uses those skills to preserve Apache history. In 1959, he publishes I Fought with Geronimo, a memoir that captures the warrior's voice and perspective in ways no white historian could manage. The very literacy forced upon him becomes a weapon for cultural preservation. Sam Kenoi represents another form of survival, also processed through Pratt's civilization machine. Kenoi becomes an anthropological informant, working with researchers who want to document vanishing Apache customs before they disappear entirely. But Kenoi plays a sophisticated game. He shares certain knowledge while protecting sacred information. He reveals enough to satisfy academic curiosity while preserving the most important spiritual secrets for his own people. The anthropologists think they're documenting a dying culture. Kenoi knows he's ensuring its survival. This is the pattern that emerges from the Fort Marion experience, Apache people learning to navigate between two worlds without losing their souls. They master the tools of the dominant culture while maintaining the essence of their own identity. The children who cried over milk and cookies grow into adults who understand something their captors never grasped. Survival sometimes requires adaptation that looks like surrender but isn't. Consider the legal battles that begin emerging in the 1920s and 30s. Apache descendants of Fort Marion prisoners, armed with European-American education and legal knowledge, start fighting back through the court system. Water rights lawsuits that challenge centuries of assumption about who owns the streams flowing through traditional Apache territory. Land claims based on treaties their ancestors signed under duress. Sovereignty arguments that use American legal principles to defend Apache. Self-determination. These court battles represent warfare by other means, tactical. Brilliance applied to a different kind of battlefield. Apache lawyers wielding law books instead of rifles, fighting for their people's future with the same strategic intelligence their grandfathers brought to mountain campaigns. But perhaps the most important transformation happens in the realm of education itself. The boarding school system that Pratt pioneered spreads across the continent, traumatizing generations of native children from dozens of tribes. Yet something unexpected emerges from this shared suffering, a pan-Indian movement that transcends traditional tribal boundaries. Children from different peoples, thrown together in institutions designed to destroy their cultures, discover common ground in resistance to cultural genocide. Apache children, forbidden to speak their own language, begin learning Lakota and Cherokee words. Kiowa and Comanche students share stories with Navajo and Pueblo classmates. Traditional enemies become allies in the fight to preserve something essential about indigenous identity. The government intended to destroy tribal consciousness by mixing different peoples together. Instead, they accidentally created a broader native identity that will reshape indigenous politics for generations to come. World War II becomes a turning point in this transformation. Apache men who grew up hearing stories of Geronimo's resistance volunteer to fight for the same government that imprisoned their families. They serve with distinction in the Pacific and European theaters, earning decorations for valor while proving their patriotism beyond question. But they return home changed by the experience. They've seen how other countries treat their indigenous peoples. They've fought alongside men from different backgrounds who respected their abilities. They've gained confidence in their right to full American citizenship while maintaining their Apache identity. These veterans become leaders in the emerging civil rights movement that will transform American Indian policy in the post-war era. They understand both worlds, traditional Apache culture and modern American society, and they refuse to choose between them. The 1960s bring unprecedented changes to Apache country. The American Indian movement challenges government paternalism with direct action tactics borrowed from the civil rights struggle. Young Apache activists, educated in schools designed to destroy their culture, use that education to fight for cultural preservation. Language immersion programs begin appearing on Apache reservations. Elders who survived the boarding school trauma start teaching traditional skills to grandchildren who'd grown up speaking only English. Ceremonies that were driven underground begin re-emerging into public practice. The sacred mountains that Geronimo died longing to see again become the focus of legal battles to protect traditional religious sites from development. Apache people, armed with environmental law and constitutional protections for religious freedom, fight to preserve the spiritual landscape that anchors their cultural identity. The ironies multiply with each passing decade. Apache people use European legal concepts to defend indigenous rights. Traditional stories are preserved through modern technology. Ancient ceremonies are protected by contemporary American laws. The casino boom of the 1980s and 90s brings new challenges and opportunities. Some Apache communities use gaming revenues to fund language preservation programs, cultural centers, and educational initiatives that would have been impossible under the old system of government control. Others worry that economic success comes at the cost of cultural authenticity. The debates echo arguments that have persisted since Fort Marion. How much adaptation is acceptable before you lose your essential identity? But the children learning Apache languages in immersion schools today would recognize something familiar in their great-great-grandparents who whispered traditional stories in Fort Marion's stone chambers. The forms have changed, but the underlying commitment to cultural survival remains constant. Today, Apache ceremonies echo once again through the Chiricahua Mountains of southeastern Arizona. Young people learn traditional crafts from elders who carry knowledge passed down through generations of hardship. Warriors serve in the American military with pride, understanding that defending their country doesn't require abandoning their heritage. The milk and cookies that made Apache children cry at Fort Marion have become symbols not of defeat, but of survival. Those tears represented grief for a lost way of life, but also the stubborn refusal to let that grief destroy hope for the future. Modern Apache people understand something their ancestors always knew. Culture isn't a museum piece to be preserved under glass. It's a living thing that grows and changes while maintaining its essential character. The language programs on today's Apache reservations don't just teach vocabulary and grammar. They transmit ways of thinking, of relating to the natural world, of understanding the connections between past and future that make Apache people who they are. The young Apache soldiers serving in Iraq and Afghanistan carry forward a warrior tradition that stretches back through Geronimo and Cochise to ancestors whose names are lost to history. They understand that defending freedom abroad and preserving culture at home are part of the same fundamental commitment. The legal battles continue in modern courtrooms where Apache lawyers argue for water rights, religious freedom, and sovereignty using skills their great-grandparents learned in institutions designed to destroy their people. Every victory represents warfare by other means, the same tactical brilliance applied to different battlefields. But perhaps the most important victory is the simplest one. Apache children today grow up knowing who they are and where they come from. They learn the stories of Geronimo and Cochise not as ancient history, but as family heritage that shapes their understanding of what it means to be Apache. They visit the sacred mountains that their ancestors died longing to see again. They speak languages that survived systematic attempts at destruction. They practice ceremonies that were driven underground but never truly disappeared. The eagle that was caged at Fort Marion has learned to fly in new skies. Different skies than their ancestors knew, but skies that belonged to them nonetheless. Captain Pratt believed he could kill the Indian, save the man, through systematic cultural destruction. He failed completely. The Apache children, who entered his civilization machine emerged changed, but not destroyed, adapted but not assimilated, educated but not conquered. They learned to use the tools of the dominant culture while preserving the essence of their own identity. They discovered that survival sometimes requires flexibility that looks like surrender but isn't. Most importantly, they proved something their captors never understood. You cannot kill a people's spirit by breaking their bodies or forbidding their languages or cutting their hair. The spirit lives in the stories past, from one generation to the next. It survives in the songs whispered in darkness, the ceremonies practiced in secret, the simple act of remembering who you are and where you come from. That spirit adapted to conditions no people should have to endure. It found new ways to express ancient truths. It learned to soar in skies their ancestors never imagined. And it endures today in every Apache child who learns traditional songs, in every ceremony that echoes through sacred mountains, in every story told around modern fires by people who refuse to let their heritage die. The eagles have risen from the ashes. They remember how to fly, and they will soar as long as the sacred mountains stand and the desert wind calls their names across the landscape of home.